Let's take a listen to this.
Hello?
Congratulations! You've been selected to receive a free cruise to the Bahamas. And like most cruises, all of the expenses are included. All we would like is for you to participate in a short survey. You are receiving 2 free boarding passes for an all-inclusive cruise to the Bahamas.
Well, congratulations on being awarded the complimentary cruise.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Stir, Shake, and Sip to Stop Robocalling. And congratulations on winning a free cruise to the Bahamas. You're at the right place. Now, John also received that call, and he was very excited. He decided to make a family vacation of it. So he purchased 2 additional tickets for his children and purchased all kinds of upgrades. He updated their cabins, added food and drinks packages, and other activities so the family would have a perfect time. John gave the trusty travel agent their social insurance numbers, their credit card details, and passport numbers. The travel was booked, and John was all set. A week before departure, John called the trusty travel agent, and to his dismay, the telephone number had been disconnected. The company had folded, and John had been scammed out of nearly $10,000. Now, John is not alone in stories like this. In the US, there were 5.2 billion robocalls placed in the month of January alone. That's 1 month. That's an average of about 16 robocalls per person. Does that sound about right based on the number of robocalls you're getting? That's great. So about half of those, a little less than half, 42%, were scams. And an estimated $9.5 billion was lost by Americans to phone scams in 2017. So why has technology not addressed this issue? As you can see, it's complicated. Not all robocalls are bad, and then there's caller ID spoofing. But let me explain. When ET phones home with a pre-recorded message and repeatedly dials your number without your consent, that's illegal robocalling. And when you see ET on your call display, but you get Mr. Dog on the line, that's caller ID spoofing. Now, not all robocalls are spoofed, and not all spoof calls are robocalls. And then there are legitimate uses for both caller ID spoofing and robocalls. Doctors, lawyers, private investigators use caller ID spoofing to protect their privacy. And then you have things like weather alerts, public announcements, appointment reminders, doctor's appointments reminders that may use both caller ID spoofing and robocalling. So this makes it really difficult for technology to tell the difference between an illegitimate robocall and a good one and block only the bad ones. So it was not that long ago that our emails used to be clogged and cluttered with junk mail. But we have become quite a bit better at cleaning out our emails. This is because emails can be dropped on servers, analyzed and cleansed before delivery. You can apply keywords and blacklists and advanced analytics. Voice, on the other hand, is a real-time service. It doesn't lend itself to being analyzed before delivery. And even if you could, there's very little preceding information. You might get time of day, maybe telephone number, which may or may not be spoofed. And then we have such a sense of privacy about our phone calls that we wouldn't stand for anybody eavesdropping and listening to call content before it was delivered to us. So robocallers are quite relentless in their pursuit for financial gain. And there are several models for this. First, hire a robocall service. This is a really accessible, easy to set up service. It's technically easy to set up. The price point is really is accessible as well. And I would encourage you to check it out on the internet. The biggest pot of money they make is, of course, from scamming victims. And it's in the tune of billions of dollars that we just discussed. And there's a third model, and it's one of micropayments, and a rather interesting one. So in the US, we have caller name or CNAM databases that are managed by third parties, not service providers. Each time a phone call comes in, a service provider turns around and looks up the CNAM database to retrieve the caller name associated with the telephone number that came in. Each time the service provider looks up the CNAM database, a small amount of money is paid, micropayment. So in the summer of last year, there were numerous articles and publications that came out suggesting that there's a revenue sharing model between CNAM database owners and robocallers. This means that robocallers are now incented to call simply to trigger the service provider to look up the CNAM database so that money changes hands and they get paid. Essentially, robocallers make money even when you don't answer your phone calls. All it takes is for a service provider to look up the CNAM database. It's not a lot of money. It's about $300 for 100,000 phone calls. So it's slow pennies, but it's steady and reliable income. Think about it. It's as simple as downloading freeware, hooking it up on your laptop, setting it up to auto-dial telephone numbers, thousands of numbers an hour. So robocalling, illegal robocalling, is the #1 consumer complaint in the US, UK, and Canada. And consumers are routinely scammed out of their money. And while consumers say that telephone is their preferred mode of communications, their trust in the service is eroding and they're answering the phone calls a lot less. And in retrospect, about 75% of consumers say that they have missed important phone calls as a result. Businesses, while they use numerous modes of digital communications, they still interact with their customers via the telephone. Businesses say about 80% of their business calls go unanswered. And to make things worse, when robocallers impersonate them and scam their clients, businesses take a hit to their brand name and reputation. And it gets even worse. To top, when attempts have been made to block illegal robocalls, business calls have been flagged as suspicious and blocked as well. So businesses are really unhappy with the situation. Illegal robocalling, of course, costs service providers. It's power, bandwidth, infrastructure, throughput that is much better allocated to some other revenue-generating service. So illegal robocalling simply costs service providers. So at this point, robocalling has gone past the point of simply being a nuisance and into the domain of serious business revenues. And as we're moving from TDM analog services into IP VoIP environments, the global VoIP market is forecasted to grow at 100 to 190 billion by 2024. Surely, we cannot afford a third to a half of that to be attributed to illegal robocallers and scammers. So it's time to do something about it, and we have a solid business case to do so as well. So Stir Shaken is not about your martinis. I'm sorry to disappoint. It's a little bit early in the morning, don't you think? So one of the reasons robocalling has been as challenging to stop is caller ID spoofing. And this makes it really difficult to validate the origin of a call. Stir Shaken addresses exactly this issue. So in the past several years, pretty much everybody in the industry, all stakeholders, you have standards bodies, telephone operators, service providers, policymakers, they've all come together to develop a call authentication call validation solution. STIR, which is Secure Telephone Identity Revisited, is a standard of protocols used to implement digital signatures for telephone numbers of calling parties. Shaken is a framework used to implement STIR. So when protocols are implemented in networks, they tend to be variations in implementations leading to interoperability issues. And in the US, we have about 3,000 service providers. That could be a lot of interoperability issues. So Shaken simply prescribes policies and guidelines to equipment vendors and service providers on how to implement STIR. But most importantly, STIR Shaken now provides us with a mechanism for real-time authentication of telephone numbers that will help us address the problem of illegal caller ID spoofing and robocalling. So the telephony landscape is a complex one with numerous technologies and various players. A telephone call could originate from a plain old POTS line, could come in from a VoIP phone, could come in from a PC, a tablet, a VoIP client on a mobile phone. It could be a single line, could come in on a PBX, and there could be just as many variations on the terminating side. When the point of origin and the end point of a call are not serviced by the same carrier, you might have intermediate service providers and networks. And depending on if the call is national, regional, or international, you will have multiple intermediate networks and service providers. All this to say that the telephony landscape is a complicated one with numerous players and technologies. And over the past decade, we have seen a steady migration from TDM analog onto the IP SIP environments. And reports have it, and we know, that about half of the illegal robocalls originate on the IP SIP environment. So it so follows that STIR/SHAKEN is focused on IP SIP technologies only. So the solution that we're about to discuss, STIR/SHAKEN, the scope is IP SIP only, and the rationale for that being that it's seen as the way of the future from a technical evolution standpoint. So here is a high-level conceptual diagram of the STIR/SHAKEN solution. Imagine that Bob wants to call Alice, and they both have SIP endpoints. Bob's user agent creates a SIP invite, inserts his telephone number in the header, and forwards it to the authentication server for his domain. The server authenticates Bob and checks to see if he's authorized to use the telephone number he claimed in the SIP invite. The authentication server then creates a digitally signed identity token, inserts it in the SIP header, and sends it along to Alice's domain. The verification server reaches out to the certificate repository, retrieves the public keys, and then verifies the signature. If the signature verifies, the call is delivered to Alice. If the signature does not verify, the call may still be delivered to Alice, only with a flag, or the call may be dropped, and it really depends on how the policy is set up in the environment. So here is the STIR/SHAKEN reference architecture. This is a logical depiction, so actual implementations might vary. And we're also using 3GPP's IMS architecture for purposes of illustration and discussion. The boxes in blue exist today in the IMS, and the boxes in gray are new as a result of STIR/SHAKEN. So there's not a lot of IMS, so don't worry about it. So let me take you through the components. So the SIP UA here, if I can get the pointer there, yeah, is the user agent and the telephone device through which you receive and make phone calls. It could be a soft client. The call session control function is the routing engine of the IMS. So it basically essentially routes calls. The interconnection border gateway is a service provider edge and is the NNI, or the IP peering point, by which the service provider peers with other carriers. So that's it for the IMS. So let's look at the STIR/SHAKEN components. So on the far right, I'll start on the other side. So we have the authentication server there, which is an application server, and its function is to authenticate the caller, as well as sign the calls. It has a secure interface to the secure key store, which houses the private keys in the solution. On the top center, you have the certificate repository, which houses the corresponding public keys. On the top far right there, you have the certificate provisioning authority, which is a logical entity that's responsible for generating certificates for the framework. On the right side here, you have service provider B. The verification server is an application server, and its function is to verify signatures. And then you have the call validation treatment, CVT, which is an optional component, and it adds additional analytics information in terms of anti-spoofing and the like, and it could be local to the service provider, it could be a third-party service, or even a cloud service. So let me take you through a call flow, and the solution will come together. So the SIP UA, or the user agent, now initiates a call, creates a SIP invite, inserts a telephone number in it, and sends it to the routing engine of the IMS. The IMS now triggers the authentication server. The authentication server now requests from the secure key store the private keys associated with the telephone number that was claimed in the SIP header. The authentication server now signs the call and returns it back to the IMS, the routing engine, the CSCF, and the call is routed outbound towards the carrier's edge, towards the egress point, and into the ingress point of the terminating service provider, the IBCF. The call is then routed to the routing engine on the other side, the IMS, which in turn triggers the verification server. The verification server now extracts the URI from the SIP invite for the location of the public keys, the certificate repository. It reaches out to the certificate repository, requests the public keys, and then validates the signature. At this point, the optional component, the call validation treatment, might be invoked for additional call analytics information, anti-spoofing, and CVT might also provide treatment information on positive or negative validation of signatures at the verification server. So the additional information is now added to the call, and the call is forwarded on to the terminating UA. And a media session is now set up between the two endpoints. You have either a voice or a video call progressing there. So the magic of stir-shaken happens at the authentication server and the verification server, where a call is signed and a call is verified. So when the verification is successful, it essentially means that you have received the same telephone number at the time it was signed. So you know there was no caller ID telephone number spoofing that occurred in that path. So depending on the degree to which a service provider can vouch for a telephone number, different levels of attestations are applied to a call. An attestation is applied at the point a call enters the IP networks or originates onto the IP network. So when a service provider has no relationship with the caller or the telephone number, chances are it was the gateway point where the call entered the IP network. So a gateway attestation is applied. When the service provider can validate the caller, but not the telephone number behind, a partial attestation is applied, and an example of this would be a trunk group, or a PBX, or even call centers, where sometimes a call center is authorized to use the business name and a main number, but you can't see the telephone numbers behind that main number, right? So at that point, a partial attestation is applied. And when the service provider has complete authenticated relationships, both with the caller and the telephone number, a full attestation is applied, and this is the most trusted form of call that comes through on the network. So security professionals, we know that every solution has security architecture considerations, and stir-shaken is no different. And in keeping with the martinis, I won't serve up a full-course security meal, although when you do implement, you do need to consider every layer of security, the hardware, infrastructure, application, networking. You all need that. But I will be serving up choice security appetizers or key considerations when you implement stir-shaken architectures. So robocalling, combined with caller ID spoofing and impersonation, enables numerous attacks. Vishing, which is phishing over VoIP, spit, spam over telephony, internet telephony, and swatting impersonates callers to emergency services, dispatching them to a particular address. Caller ID spoofing also enables the use of invalid, unallocated numbers such as 000, 000 that we so commonly see on our call displays. And this technique is also used for voicemail hacking. And this is only a sampling of attacks here. So clearly we, as a security community, we do need to partner with our voice colleagues in this battle against robocalling. So security architectures vary greatly across, and this varies not only based on the technologies that are in place, but they also reflect the risk appetite of an organization as well as the security maturity of an organization. And another point to note is stir-shaken is still being trialed and tested, so there might be upgrades and updates that come out as a result. It's a moving space, so keep your eye out in terms of any developments that occur as well. And there might be a couple of security things that I will talk to that come across as foundational or fundamental, but I've seen them overlooked so often in the voice environment that I really feel it's worth the conversation. So stir-shaken infrastructure. Again, you will see diverse set of implementations. This could be a third-party, off-the-shelf vendor product, or you could use open source software. You might have network gear local to your environment, or you might implement stir-shaken in private or even in public clouds. So when you go out there and go, where's stir-shaken? I wanted you to know if you were looking for a bird or plane or a cocktail. And at this point, you could have any of the above, any of those variations. I also wanted to point out that voice is a real-time service, and if you remember the IT/OT conversations from the keynotes, availability is very important for voice because it's a real-time service, and although we as security professionals focus a lot on confidentiality and integrity, I do want to mention scalability, resiliency, redundancy is really important for voice services, regardless of the type of infrastructure you use for stir-shaken. And also keep in mind cloud security principles if you're architecting in the cloud, and there have been plenty of talks on that topic, so I won't go in there. Data sensitivity. This is a counterintuitive topic when it comes to the voice environment. And it's an important one nonetheless because it drives security architectures. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard, but Daksha, we're voice operations, we have no data. Yes, you do, my friend. You have the private keys that need to be kept really secure as they're foundational to the legitimacy of the stir-shaken operations. Then you have customer-related and customer-centric data points, such as telephone number, caller name, IP addresses. Some of this might be PII, may need to be treated as PII. As well, some of this data actually flows in the SIP control layer. And then, of course, you have system configuration, infrastructure variables that need to be treated as non-public, and public keys for STIR/SHAKEN that need to be accessed by third parties. So all of this will actually drive architectures, and we also need to stay mindful of what data we have and where it's flowing. And this leads us to the topic of security zoning. So if your organization is using the traditional zones model, think about all the components in the STIR/SHAKEN solution. The SKS, which is a secure key store that houses the private keys, needs to be placed in nothing less than the most trusted zone in your environment. The CSCF, which is the routing engine and is the control plane of the IMS, may be placed in the trusted zone. And for components such as the certificate repository, you would consider factors that it needs to be accessed by third parties in its zones placement. Now, if your organization is using the zero trust model, and we've heard a lot of talks about the zero trust model at RSA, you will assume a default deny posture. You will apply policies at a granular level, microsegmentation, and you will monitor it through a centralized control plane. The methodology is different. However, you're still considering the security posture required by each of the elements in STIR/SHAKEN. So here are some of the main protocols used in the STIR/SHAKEN solution. SIP, Session Initiation Protocol, is an application layer protocol, and it's used for call session setup, session management, session teardown. RTP, Real-Time Transport Protocol, and is used for the transportation of voice and video over IP. So can anyone tell me if SIP and RTP run over TCP or UDP? Who thinks TCP? Who thinks UDP? You're actually both right. SIP and RTP can run both over TCP and UDP. However, there's a preference for implementing SIP over TCP because we like reliability in our control signals. And there's a preference for implementing RTP over UDP because media has better tolerance to packet loss. So in the STIR/SHAKEN framework, there's a lot of calls where you retrieve keys and certificates over HTTP. Do make sure that these protocols are secure, use TLS. And if you're using SNMP for management of any network elements, do make sure you're using the latest versions, basic security hygiene version 3, and then be mindful of the data you gather for network management as well as the data sensitivity around it. Now, SIP protocol standards, as well as SIP appliances, typically support the implementation of SIP over TLS. Surprisingly, SIP over TLS is not very commonly implemented. And in order to protect the data on SIP, which is telephone number, caller name, and in the case of STIR/SHAKEN, the digitally signed identity token, the use of SIP over TLS is strongly recommended. And this would protect against man-in-the-middle attacks and eavesdropping. Similarly, for RTP, the use of SRTP, Secure Real-Time Transport Protocol, would offer confidentiality, integrity, and replay protection. Now, SRTP is not a transport layer protocol. You could still have RTP running over TCP or UDP. It's simply RTP encrypted, and the keys have been exchanged over SIP. Now think about it. If you have implemented SIP without TLS, so you have SIP running in the clear, and you decide to encrypt your media, and you implement SRTP, you're now essentially exchanging the keys over SIP in the clear. So you really then, in that situation, you really haven't got around the problem of man-in-the-middle attacks and eavesdropping. But one of the biggest concerns we as security professionals hear when recommending encryption is the impact to performance. And studies show, when comparing jitter and latency between secure and unsecured VoIP, that there is negligible impact to voice quality and throughput. So we strongly recommend implementing SIP over TLS and SRTP in conjunction. And I recommend going back and looking at the reference architecture and looking at where you see the protocol pairs flowing through and then implementing both as you deploy. So for STIR/SHAKEN, key management and key and certificate management governance is a big topic. I will cover only the certificate generation piece, but I have additional information for you in the appendix to look over and reference as well in your own time. So the STI-PA, the policy administrator, which is the box in orange here, acts as a trust anchor for the STIR/SHAKEN solution. STI, of course, stands for Secure Telephone Identity, and that abbreviation flows right through this presentation. The STI-PA also designates service providers by issuing them service provider code tokens, allowing them to participate in the STIR/SHAKEN framework itself. So once they have the token, they can authenticate and validate calls. And the STI-PA also maintains a list of those. In addition, the STI-PA also maintains a list of all the certificate authorities that are participating in the solution. And the STI-CA, of course, acts as the root CA for the solution. So now when a service provider wants a public key certificate, it generates a public-private key pair. It creates a certificate signing request and sends it along to the STI-CA along with the service provider code token. So this code token will find itself in the public key certificate that's returned back in a later step. The STI-CA validates the identity of the service provider, and the certificate is generated and is returned back to the service provider. That's if the STI-CA is, of course, satisfied with the identity verification. Keep in mind that the private key associated with that public key will be used to sign calls, and the signature will find itself in a token in the SIP invite. I mean, we'll talk about it a little bit down, but I just want to point that out here. So there's a couple of security things here before we move on. Key management, key storage is a big topic and an important one, and I have material for you in the appendix for that as well. And I do want to point out that the public key certificates that are issued here, they're not unique to service providers, and they're not unique to telephone numbers either. Certificates that are issued might contain blocks and sets of telephone numbers, and even thousands of them. So this means that when a certificate is called up, there is the possibility of exposure of telephone numbers that are not related to the call in progress. So there could be some privacy issues here. So keep your eye, when architecting the solution, keep an eye on the flow of the certificate, even though it's a public certificate, and be mindful of authentication and flow when you architect. So several quirky things about the STIR/SHAKEN solution. The calls are not uniquely signed, and we just saw certificates contain blocks and sets of telephone numbers, so it's not uniquely signed. STIR/SHAKEN certificates are short-lived. They live 5 or 10 minutes. So this means that if a certificate is compromised, a bad actor can misuse them for only 5 or 10 minutes at a time. And given this is a relatively new concept, the costing and the pricing model for the CA is still being figured out, so it's a work in progress. And there is still discussion underway that perhaps the solution, the STIR/SHAKEN solution, can get around having the overhead of CRLs and OCSPs because the certificates are short-lived. They live 5 minutes anyways. And of course, at the time of validation of signatures, you need to validate the signature, but you also need to validate that was signed by a trusted root CA. Now on to the topic of tokens. And there are several tokens in the STIR/SHAKEN solution. And I will speak to only a couple of them. The service provider code token, as we just discussed earlier, is issued by the STI policy administrator and designates a service provider onto the STIR/SHAKEN environment, allowing them to participate in the solution. The persona assertion token, or the passport, is used to assert the telephone number or the identity and is placed in the SIP header in the invite of a call. Both of these are JSON Web Tokens, or JOTs. And on the screen, there's a couple of JOTs. If you can't see it at the back, don't worry about it. They're just JOTs. You can just Google them. So I just wanted you to know what they look like. Now, JOTs are inherently base64 encoded, not to be mistaken for encryption. And JOTs have the facility for being digitally signed, and this may or may not be used. Insecure implementation of JOTs can lead to replay attacks, cut and paste attacks, and exposure to privacy-sensitive information. So in order to secure this, first, if you can help it, don't put privacy-sensitive information in the claims, and this may or may not be possible. It really depends. Then sign and encrypt the JOTs in that order, and of course ensure that there is security in transit as this token flows through the solution. So again, I would strongly recommend now going back to the STIR/SHAKEN solution, keeping tokens in mind, keep an eye on all the tokens, what the claims are, and what the flow is, and apply the principles we just discussed. Caching. So when a terminating service provider now receives a call, they turn around and they reach out to the certificate repository to retrieve the public keys. So the round trip between any two servers in the US is around 100 milliseconds. So what might you do if you want to reduce this round trip? What might you do to the certificates to shave off this 100 milliseconds? You might. What might you do to the certificates? You might cache the certificates. So this leads us to an interesting problem here because stir-shaken certificates are short-lived. So cache design is a really important concept. So cache freshness, lifecycle management, cache renewal. You need to watch it when you design or the solution will fail. Now on the incoming side, you have millions of calls coming in onto the originating service provider end. And because it's a real-time service, we want to rapidly sign these calls and send them on their way. So there is a temptation to extract all the private keys from the secure key store and cache it locally. Okay, so now this gets even more interesting. We've actually been looking at only half the architecture, right? We've been looking at a call flow that goes from service provider A to B. But in reality, both service providers have all the components of the solution. So each service provider has an authentication server and a verification server. So essentially, you're looking at two application servers, one caching public keys, one caching private keys, and there's always a potential to place it on a safe host. Just watch how you design and place it and ensure that there's no intermingling of public and private keys. So as we discussed earlier, the telephony technologies, this is a complex landscape, and you could have numerous technologies even on a single call flow. And even on an end-to-end SIP call, you have numerous devices and paths, such as session border controllers, SIP proxies, SIP gateways. And the way the SIP protocol is written, the SIP header might be rewritten at every hop. But where did we put the digitally signed identity token for stir-shaken? In the SIP header. So stir-shaken expects a service provider to be able to transport a call from the point of origin through the VoIP network to the endpoint while maintaining the integrity of the SIP header. So this means we might need some upgrades and updates to some of the appliances and paths so that the SIP header is maintained intact as it flows through. So there's some work to be done there. On the user agent side, we are now receiving calls that have different levels of attestation of full, partial, and gateway. And this information is only useful if the end device or the client is able to display this, and the consumer is able to make an informed choice on whether or not to accept or drop the call. Okay. Are you good? Does this work? Hello? Is that on? Okay, is this on? Okay, so this is not on either, okay. All right. Has it come back? I think it's come back, right? No. Okay, can you hear me? I'll just keep talking then. All right, okay, you can hear me there, right? That's good. So all this to say that I think there's work to be done by us as security professionals, and we do need to partner with our voice colleagues, not only in this battle against robocalling, but also in the secure implementation of stir-shaken. And stir-shaken is no silver bullet. We do need to continue to take a multi-layered approach. So continue to use the do not call registry, continue to use applications such as No More Robo, Haya, Umail, and there's plenty of other applications, third-party applications. And sometimes a service provider might also provide specific applications. So these applications leverage the simultaneous ring features of your telephone, and they maintain blacklists and profiles of robocallers, and they screen the call for you. So when a call comes in and the profile matches, they essentially hang up, so it spares you the interaction with the robocaller. And oftentimes, based on the subscriber base, when a telephone number comes in, they can see a telephone number calling out thousands of telephone numbers, and which could match the profile of a pre-registered, illegal robocaller, so they might hang up as well. So for these applications, if you have a smartphone, you can go to your app store, download these applications, or you can go to the service provider, the application websites, and put in the name of your service provider and telephone number and see what features are available to you. And last and new, we now have STIR/SHAKEN on the service provider side that provides call authentication and call validation on the IPSIP technology. So now we're kind of adding another layer to all the elements we have to protect ourselves against robocalling. And actually, it will strengthen the other applications as well, because if you have a blacklist and caller ID spoofing is used, there might be some errors that occur. Because of call authentication and STIR/SHAKEN, it will mitigate that, and there will be reliability right through the other applications as well. So when you go home for the next 30 days, I would like for you to go find out what voice technologies you have in place. Are you using TDM? Are you using POTS? Do you have IPSIP? Are you using proprietary protocols? What solutions do you have for addressing robocalls at this time? Do you have contact centers? What's going on in those contact centers? What technologies are there? And of course, this is an active space, so there's a lot of standards development going on. The IPNNI Joint Task Force is actually looking for people. They would love to have cybersecurity people in there, so please do check it out and join them if you can. In the next 60 days, of course, consumers continue to protect yourself against illegal robocalls. And some of these architectures, because they are carrier architectures, you might not have direct access to them or visibility into them. Enterprises, of course, connect up with your voice experts. Find out what equipment needs update to maintain that integrity of the SIP header. So if your service provider is giving you levels of attestation so that it at least flows through your network and solution. Service providers, find out what your voice colleagues are doing, what vendor equipment you have, whether you're going to get a third-party vendor solution for STIR/SHAKEN, or you're going to go with an open source solution. What levels of attestation might you provide your customers? Because this is essentially a business decision, right? And how you're going to display it on the customer's caller ID. And for equipment vendors, do find out if your equipment can flow through SIP protocol while maintaining the integrity. And if it does, maybe you have a selling feature right up front that you already support STIR/SHAKEN up front. For the next 90 days, of course, continue to protect yourself for consumers. But since STIR/SHAKEN is expected to be implemented in a year by most carriers, you might start seeing features, or you might start seeing flags show up in your call display, and now you might recognize them for STIR/SHAKEN. And of course, you might also receive an opt-in request from your service provider. It really depends on how they're operating and managing it. And for enterprises, carriers, and equipment vendors, do partner with your voice colleagues, do find out what they're doing, and of course, share all your newfound knowledge about securing STIR/SHAKEN with them to ensure a secure deployment of STIR/SHAKEN. And with that, I'd like to bring you to the session objectives. I'm hoping we get a yes for all of these. Did I take you through the robocalling problem and related voice crimes? Yes. Did I take you through the STIR/SHAKEN framework? Yes. And did I take you through security architecture considerations for STIR/SHAKEN? So yes, thank you. So with that, I bring you to the end of this talk. I'd like to shout out to all the women in cybersecurity. It is International Women's Day today. So yay for that. And thank you for your attention. And I will open it up for any questions if there's time. I don't know where we're at. I got that awesome. Take a sip of the martini.
Thank you very much for that very informative presentation. Just as a side note, do any of these abilities that you mentioned provide reports or feedback? I'm particularly interested in what you might be able to shine light on regarding the National Do Not Call Registry. I've signed up, but I don't have any way of knowing how effective it is and so on. It would be nice to be able to say the 16 calls you got are the 1% that got through the 160 or 16,000 you would have received?
That's a great question, and I wish there was a mechanism, right? The STIR/SHAKEN solution is a little bit independent of the Do Not Call registry. So And as for StirShaken itself at this point, I think it's still early on. I don't think we have a reporting mechanism developed yet, but I think it'll become visible as we operationalize. We would probably be able to track the number of calls that had full attestation, partial, and gateway. And this will increase over a period of time, right? As more carriers deploy it, we'll start seeing more trusted calls than the ones that we don't recognize, right? So we might get that kind of reporting for StirShaken. I know I don't answer your question exactly. Yeah.
Hi, sorry. I'm a reporter and I'm thinking about doing this, or aspects of this for a story. So first of all, will your slides be online?
Yes.
Okay, great. And second of all, I came in a bit late and you may have addressed this already, but we're obviously seeing a huge uptake in robocalling in the past 6 months even. I mean, I think everyone's noticed it. Are robocalls trying to kind of get everything in through the door before the StirShaken comes into effect? It seems like that might be an aspect.
You mean deliberately spike up and get the robocalling out of the way before StirShaken goes in?
It seems like the door's going to be slammed on them in the next year or so, and maybe they're trying to get as much as they can.
When you look at the trend lines, they're certainly growing month over month, and I just see it as ease of technology, and it's open source software that allows auto dialing, and it's convenience, and they're making money while they can. And it's certainly going to get tightened up, but I haven't spoken with the robocaller directly to see what their plan strategy is, right? If I knew, I could, yeah.
All right, okay.
I suspect, right, if they see something coming through, they'd want to make money while they can, yeah.
Oh, I forgot one more thing. People are suspecting that the phone companies don't do much about robocalling because they make money off it. I don't know if that's true.
No, we're working very hard to address this issue, right? We are concerned with the safety and well-being of our consumers, and we want to deliver the best service that we can. So we actually have all of this, and I don't think this is not a revenue generator for us, right? It's just something in the best interest of making sure the community is, better served.
Thanks.
Yeah, I was just curious, are you familiar with, or can you expand on a little bit, the revenue that's generated from the $300 for 100,000 calls? There's some database that gets hit and a transaction occurs that, I didn't catch how that money could get back to a robocall.
And there were several articles on this, even in the Wall Street Journal last year. So if I don't address all of it, it's certainly available to look at. So, and this is specific to the U.S. on how caller names are handled. In Canada, the caller name is actually put in the SIP header right up front. So it's just differences between countries. And there's about 8 or 9 major CNAM database owners in the U.S. that actually handle caller names. And there's a telephone number that is regulated and allocated by service providers and even regions, right? They're actually allocated. So when the call comes in, the service provider turns around and looks up that CNAM database to retrieve the caller name. So when they look up that database, it's a service, right? So they pay a small amount of money, and it's transactional, right? It's tiny, it's a small amount of money. And these articles indicate that there is a revenue sharing model between the two of them, right? The CNAM database owners and robocallers, right? So if a robocaller now calls and the service provider looks up, the service provider doesn't even need to deliver the call, right? The consumer doesn't even need to pick up the call. Just because there's a lookup, the service provider pays the CNAM database owner, and there's a revenue share there, right? So does that make sense? To the robocaller, but it's a service provider who's paying for it, right? They do a lookup, they pay them money, but then they share the revenues, right? So the more robocalls come in, the more lookups occur, so there's a mutual interest there, right? You're welcome. All right, well, thank you very much.